Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Ab-Soul, titled These Days. Now, I've mentioned in the past that every critic, hell, the mainstream musical press at this point, they're smart to keep their eyes on Top Dog Entertainment, the indie record label that signed Kendrick Lamar, amongst others. Over the past few years, the label has very quickly garnered a reputation for very high-quality rap music, and it's always interesting for me as a critic to take that first look into the various artists on that label. Now, Kendrick Lamar, everybody should know this guy at this point. And I've already talked about Schoolboy Q and SZA when I reviewed their records that they released earlier this year. But what about Ab-Soul? Heralded as the nerd of TDE, his 2012 album Control System was a jaw-dropping fusion of creative, multifaceted references and one of the more outlandish rap releases of the year in terms of its content and its execution, if you don't count an act like Death Grips. And like all of TDE's releases, it was defined by its contradictions. Where Kendrick Lamar's Good Kid, Mad City was defined by the dichotomy between his responsibilities to his family and his own character, and the world tearing away at those responsibilities, and Schoolboy Q's Habits and Contradictions and Oxymoron was at its core defined by the gangsta doing bad things with good intentions. Ab-Soul went for something a little bit more primal, the internal battle between a wicked intellect and the ignorant, coked out nonsense that sells. And thus we got Control System, an album in a haze that might be coaxed on by drugs, but goes for something a little bit more intellectual and spiritual. And while Ab-Soul wasn't the greatest technical rapper in the game, he rhymed too many words with themselves to be really excused, and for me that got distracting. The creativity and the sheer depth to the project really demanded a certain amount of appreciation, along with the succession of killer guest verses and really strong beats. That album is one of the standouts of 2012, so you can bet that I was psyched to dig into Ab-Soul's new album titled These Days. How'd it turn out? Well, I'm conflicted about this album. I'm not gonna say this record is bad or even not good, because it's definitely a good album. But Ab-Soul's These Days, it's a step down from Control System, even though I suspect is just as ambitious, but in a very different way. Because to be blunt, this record is not as lyrical or as incredibly creative as Control System, which is one of the reasons it's a step back, at least in my books. But at the same time, I get the impression that it wasn't really trying to be, instead opting for more of a satire or even possibly a parody of modern cliches in rap music and hip-hop today, a commentary of sorts. The question then becomes whether or not he did this well, and that's where things get, well, significantly more complicated. Now, some of you are immediately asking the question, well, why the hell I'm not just taking this record as straightforward, grimy, commercially leaning as a hip-hop record? Because on the surface, that's exactly what this album is. Songs like 100 Stacks, Twack, and Feeling Us, these are hedonistic, drug and sex obsessed tracks that you can find on any mainstream hip-hop release. And honestly, they aren't exactly great bangers by that standard either. 100 Stacks has Schoolboy Q's vicious spitting and Ab-Soul imitating his flow, but then you get Mac Miller on the hook and the momentum just completely falls as flat as the Lana Del Rey sample that they used on that song. Twack, it actually's got a pretty decent synth line reminiscent of DJ Mustard. It's got some real snapping percussion with a lot of energy, but none of the guest rappers or Ab-Soul have anything all that interesting to say on that track that we haven't heard time and time again this year. And then there's the party song Feelin' Us, which features J-Rock's laziest verse in quite a while, and then you have Ab-Soul putting in a direct imitation of Chief Keef's flow, the sort of ignorance that I don't want to see anywhere near Ab-Soul. Hell, there's even a track on this record featuring Rick Ross, doing his standard subpar bragging surrounded by pitch-shifted vocals, and Ab-Soul at points imitating Drake's rap singing dichotomy. It's a really awkward fit for that track. But it's on that song where things start to get a little bit interesting, because there are these quick, static-filled cuts to Ab-Soul spitting with a lot more creativity and energy, almost suggesting that it's a commercial track that's hiding beneath it a much smarter MC. And you know what? That lends some credence to the idea that this record might be parodying or satirizing this sort of commercial rap. Sort of like what The Roots did on And Then You Shoot Your Cousin. But both satires and parodies parodies work by taking the material in offbeat or over-the-top directions or providing active commentary on the situation. And I'm not sure this album does that consistently. Dubsack, it isn't really a typical weed track, I'll admit that, but it does fall in line of a typical bragging song, and an unfocused one at that. World Runners is about chasing one's dreams and dissing those people who aren't out there hustling, just waiting for the prize to come along to them. But then again, neither Ab-Soul or Lupe Fiasco's verses are all that interesting beyond some token Prince and Illuminati references, which they aren't as interesting as they might appear, and they barely add any deeper meaning to the track. And the ghostly production, and again, the pitch-shifted vocals, they didn't exactly make it all that special or all that interesting for me. I actually really did like the songs Just Have Fun and Ride Slow, the latter featuring Danny Brown with some really flashy lyrics that I did like, but really, below that, they're just drug and brag tracks, and they aren't even really over the top by Danny Brown standards. Solid material, let me stress this, but nothing mind-blowing here. The real disappointment for me was Sapiosexual, a song talking about how women, in certain cases, are attracted to intelligence. But once you get past the nifty premise, Ab-Soul just doesn't do anything with it in terms of innovative lyricism, or the track just feels like just another sex jam, this time with a Middle Eastern-inspired melody, so I guess that's kinda unique. Because here's the point. For this to be a satire or a parody, there would need to be moments where Ab-Soul actually drives home the point he's trying to make, or at least goes so far over the top that he makes his point implicitly. But that only happens sporadically on this album. Instead, we get a somewhat detailed and more serious exploration of some of Ab-Soul's other favorite topics that he brings up in his songs, namely religion. And here's where we get some of the better tracks of the album, honestly, or at least those with a little bit more lyrical ambition. Tree of Life is probably one of the best songs on the album, both through some of the religious and ecological and biological parallels that I really liked. And I also like Stigmata and the opening track, God's Reign. But both of those songs feel like they lack a certain amount of visceral punch, or at least the vibrant, direct lyricism that I got from the previous record. Because let's be honest, there's a lot of material that could be really mind here if Ab-Soul wanted to draw that parallel between himself and Jesus. But outside of a few scattered references and the song Closure, which is a song tackling both his deceased girlfriend and his current relationship and relating them to the pressures and conflicts that he's under, the overarching themes never really coalesce into something that's more significant here. Instead, I just get the disconcerting feeling that Ab-Soul occasionally intentionally dialed back some of his tracks in terms of their lyricism in order to attract more commercial airplay in terms of some of his content. And sure, look, there's nothing wrong with that, making some pretty good party bangers. I'm all in favor of that, but they could have at least had a little bit more creative lyricism than this. They didn't have to be deep, but they could have been more creative. And that's what's really frustrating, is that on the final track, there's this 20-minute clip of a rap battle between Ab-Soul and Daylight, and Ab-Soul mostly holds his own here with some really creative and really interesting wordplay. Nothing too deep, but it could have worked here, and some of which is better than what it's on the rest of this album. And on top of that, if you're looking for more of a commercial sound, I wouldn't say that typical TDE production is always the way to go. I'm not saying that it's bad, mind you. Far from it. I really like the breezy haze of Tree of Life and Just Have Fun. And whenever this album actually dips into some of the more soulful elements, like on the latter track and on Kendrick Lamar's interlude, featuring Kendrick Lamar delivering a pretty vicious verse, it sounds great. I really like it. But the hooks on this album, they're not strong, and they lack that immediate melodic punch that would really stick with me. And look, I did like the dusty darkness of Stigmata and the ominous synthesizer tones of WROH, but for an album that might be stepping towards something of a more accessible tone on some of their tracks, the hooks, they aren't really there, and the TDE production doesn't quite fit overall. And honestly, that's probably my biggest issue with this record. There are a lot of disparate elements and intentions with this album, and none of it seems to coalesce into anything all that substantial beyond some solid, if unremarkable, drug tracks and a few steps taken toward introspection, but Ab-Soul never really approaches the level of insight or nuance that he brought on Control System, especially when it comes to politics or unique subject matter to stand out from the rest of the rappers in the scene. If that previous album was written about mind-expanding drugs, These Days was recorded while on them, and as such, it feels distant, unfocused, hazy, and a bit of a mess. The instrumentation in some of the tracks seem to apply a more serious, more underground tone, but the rest of this record feels aimed at a much lower common denominator. And of those songs, most of them really lack the hooks or the interesting flavor to make them stand out or really bang for me. And while I'm not drawing a comparison between Ab-Soul and any of the artists on TDE right now, I will say this: Ab-Soul certainly doesn't shy away from making some of those comparisons to his label mates on this album, which might not be for the best thing to do with a project that is a fair bit shakier than Control System. But you know what? All that being said, I really do like the production here. Ab-Soul is still an interesting lyricist and songwriter, and there are definitely more hits than serious misses on this record. So you know what? I'm gonna go and I'm gonna give it a very cautious 7 out of 10 and a recommendation. I can't and won't call this album great, but you know what? It is interesting and it's definitely worth consideration. So check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. On July 12th, I'm going to be going back and reviewing an album from 2013. Either an album I've already covered throughout my blog or my vlogs, or it's an album that I missed throughout the course of that year. So put your suggestions in the comments, and the album that gets the most comments is going to be the one I cover on that day. If there's any other albums coming out this year that you want me to cover, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. So until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.